The cafe smelled like freshly ground espresso and warm cinnamon rolls, the kind of scent that made people linger even after they'd finished their drinks. It was one of those places that straddled the line between cozy and chaotic, half filled with students hunched over textbooks, half occupied by parents clutching caffeine like it was a lifeline. Avery pushed open the glass door and stepped inside, rolling the tension from her shoulders as the familiar hum of conversation wrapped around her. She had exactly 23 minutes before she had to pick up Elijah from school. That meant 10 minutes to drink her coffee, 5 to pretend she wasn't worried about rent, and the rest to mentally catalog the groceries she still hadn't bought. She spotted the last open seat by the window and moved quickly, threading her way between tables before someone else could claim it. It was the perfect spot. The late afternoon sun slanted through the glass, casting golden light over the small wooden table. She sat down with a sigh of relief, took a careful sip of her coffee, and pulled out her phone. And that's when she heard it. "You've got to be kidding me." The voice came from across the table, dry and full of exasperation. Avery blinked, startled, and looked up. A man sat there, staring at her like she had just committed a personal offense against him. He wasn't just annoyed, he looked outright offended. "Excuse me," she said, narrowing her eyes. He snapped his book shut, shaking his head. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Act like you don't know me." Avery stiffened. Her brain scrambled to place him, but nothing about his face rang a bell. He had dark, slightly tousled hair, sharp cheekbones, and the kind of expression that suggested he believed he was always the smartest person in the room. "I don't know you," she said, her tone clipped. "Yes, you do." "No," she said firmly, gripping her cup a little tighter. "I really don't." The man exhaled sharply and leaned back, his gaze steady, assessing. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look unhinged. But there was something in his eyes, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. "Avery," he said. Her stomach dropped. He said her name like it was something they'd fought about before. Avery swallowed hard, trying to mask the sudden spike of unease crawling up her spine. This had to be a mistake. Maybe he thought she was someone else. Maybe she had a common face. Maybe. "You were obsessed with The Secret Garden as a kid," he said. Her breath hitched. "You had a cat named Button." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "You used to put orange juice in your cereal when you ran out of milk." Avery's grip tightened around her cup. The cafe around her blurred, the voices and clinking cups turning into a distant hum. Those weren't just random details. Those were pieces of her life. The kind of things only someone who had been there would know. A chill crept up her spine. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man, Sebastian, smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was knowing. "You don't remember?" She wanted to throw her coffee at him. "No, I don't remember, because we've never met," she snapped. Sebastian sighed, rubbing a hand over his face like she was exhausting him. "There it is," he muttered. The dramatic exit. Classic Avery. Avery's pulse roared in her ears. That wasn't just familiarity. That was the way you talked about someone you had known. Someone whose habits were etched into your memory. She stood so fast her chair scraped against the floor, drawing a few glances from the nearby tables. "I don't know what kind of game this is," she said, her voice shaking despite her best effort to keep it steady. "But I don't have time for it." Sebastian didn't stop her. He just watched, that same smug half-smile lingering on his lips. "You'll figure it out," he said. Avery turned and stormed out of the cafe, walking faster than necessary, as if she could outrun the uneasy feeling clawing at her stomach. By the time she reached the corner, she had convinced herself it had been a mistake. A weird, creepy, completely insane mistake. She didn't know him. She would have remembered if she did. Wouldn't she? Avery woke up with a dull headache, the kind that made everything feel slightly off-kilter before she had even opened her eyes. The sheets were tangled around her legs, and the morning light creeping through the curtains felt too sharp. She groaned, pressing her palms against her face, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach since yesterday's bizarre encounter at the cafe. Sebastian. The name alone made her pulse quicken. She could still hear his voice, smooth and confident, throwing facts at her that no stranger should have known. She had spent most of the night convincing herself it had been a fluke, some elaborate prank, a scam she had yet to figure out. Maybe he was one of those weird internet people who got obsessed with strangers. Maybe he had seen an old social media post, pieced things together, and used them to rattle her. But as she reached for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers hesitated before unlocking the screen. A strange sense of dread pressed down on her chest, like her body knew something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. She opened her photo gallery. The first image was a selfie she had taken last week in the park, the sun hitting her hair just right, Elijah laughing in the background. Her stomach clenched. Sebastian was in it. She blinked hard, her thumb hovering over the screen. He wasn't just standing in the background, he was right beside her, smiling as if he had always been there, like this was completely normal. Like he belonged in the frame. Avery's breath caught in her throat. She scrolled down. More pictures. More memories. Her hand started shaking as she flicked through them, each one more impossible than the last. Elijah's birthday party last year, Sebastian had his arm around her, laughing, his eyes crinkled in amusement. A trip to the beach, he was there, wearing sunglasses, his hand resting on the small of her back. An old vacation photo from when she was 16, posing awkwardly in front of a tourist attraction, he stood beside her, grinning, as if they had gone together. Avery shot out of bed so fast her knees nearly buckled. She raced to the bookshelf, grabbing an old photo album, the one her mother had put together when she was little. Her hands fumbled as she flipped through the thick pages, the plastic sheets crinkling. Every single photo. Sebastian. Holidays. Family gatherings. Her high school graduation. There was no way. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a mistake. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she tore through her drawers, yanking out old keepsakes, searching for some proof that this was wrong, that her real memories were still intact somewhere. But it was all the same. Every piece of her past had been rewritten, reshaped, restructured to include him. A choked breath escaped her lips as she clutched the album to her chest. This was real. She bolted out of her bedroom, the wooden floor cold beneath her feet as she rushed down the hallway. Elijah. She needed to see Elijah. She burst into his room, her heart hammering. He was still asleep, his small frame curled under a mess of superhero blankets. The sight of him, peaceful and unbothered, calmed her for half a second. Then she saw the drawing taped to the wall. A bright crayon sketch of a happy family, Avery, Elijah, and standing right beside them, his figure drawn in blue, a big smile on his face, was Sebastian. Her breath caught. Elijah, she whispered, her voice shaking as she nudged him. He stirred, blinking sleepily before rubbing his eyes. Mom? Avery pointed to the drawing, her fingers ice cold. Who is that? Elijah yawned, stretching his arms before following her gaze. Dad. The air left her lungs. Who? He frowned, confused by the question. Dad. Why are you asking? Avery's hands trembled. Elijah, where did you learn to draw him? Her son gave her a look that suggested she had completely lost her mind. Mom, I see him every day. She felt dizzy, like the world had shifted under her feet. This wasn't just photos. This wasn't just memories. Sebastian had woven himself into her life in a way that made everyone else believe he had always been there. She took a shaky step back, gripping the doorframe. I need to make a call. Elijah, already losing interest, mumbled something about pancakes before flopping back onto his pillow. Avery walked into the living room, forcing her breaths to slow as she grabbed her phone and dialed Maya. She needed someone to tell her she wasn't crazy. The call rang twice before her best friend's familiar voice filled the line. "Morning, babe. What's up?" Avery swallowed, her throat dry. "Maya, I need to ask you something." Maya hummed in response, distracted. "You okay? You sound weird." Avery ignored that. "Do you know someone named Sebastian?" There was a beat of silence. Then Maya laughed. "Avery, what? Are you still half asleep?" "Of course, I know Sebastian." Avery's blood ran cold. No, she muttered, pressing a hand to her temple. That's not what I mean." Maya sighed. "Look, are you mad at him? Did you guys fight or something?" The floor tilted. "What?" "You and Sebastian," Maya said, like it was obvious. "Did something happen?" Avery opened her mouth, but no words came out. Maya kept talking, completely oblivious to the panic surging through Avery's body. "He told me you guys were arguing yesterday, but I figured you'd work it out." "You always do." Avery couldn't breathe. Maya wasn't confused. She wasn't reacting with surprise or concern. She was treating this like normal. Like Sebastian was real. Like he had always been part of her life. Her fingers dug into the couch cushion. "Maya," she said slowly, her voice shaking, "how long have I known him?" Another pause. Maya let out a small, confused laugh. "Avery, are you messing with me?" Avery's chest was so tight she thought she might pass out. "I need you to tell me," she said, barely holding herself together. "How long have I known him?" Maya sighed, like she was humoring a child. "Babe, forever. You and Sebastian have been together for years." Avery's vision blurred at the edges. She dropped the phone. Avery walked into the office gripping her coffee like it was an anchor to reality. She hadn't slept. How could she? Every single part of her life had been rewritten overnight, and yet, the world continued as if nothing had happened. Elijah still expected pancakes. The news still droned on about traffic and the weather. Her phone still had reminders for dentist appointments and bills. But nothing felt real. She had told herself she just needed to get through the workday. Keep her head down, push through the emails, and avoid any deep conversations. Maybe, this was some kind of stress-induced breakdown, and by lunch, everything would snap back into place. Then Sebastian walked through the front doors of her office. She nearly dropped her coffee. He strolled in like he had every right to be there, dressed in a dark sweater and jeans that somehow still looked expensive. His eyes scanned the room, then landed on her. His expression shifted into something warm, something familiar, something that made her want to run in the opposite direction. She took a sharp breath, fingers tightening around the disposable cup. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere. Sebastian. Her voice barely came out. He grinned. "Hey, babe. Babe." The words slid through the air like an ice cube down her spine. He closed the distance between them, moving so naturally, so confidently, that her coworkers barely gave him a glance. "How'd you sleep?" he asked, as if this were a normal conversation. As if they were a normal couple. As if she hadn't spent the night tearing apart photo albums and hyperventilating over the fact that her entire existence had been rewritten. Avery took a step back, her pulse hammering. "You can't be here." Her voice was sharp, panicked, but he just tilted his head, amused. "What? I can't stop by to say hi." "I don't know you," she whispered. He laughed. Actually laughed, like she had said something funny. "Okay," he said, playing along. Is this another one of your pretend I don't know Sebastian days? What is it this time? Did I forget to take out the trash? Leave dishes in the sink? Her stomach flipped. This wasn't real. This wasn't real. She shook her head, scanning the office for someone, anyone, who looked as confused as she felt. But no one was paying attention. A few people threw glances their way, but none of them looked surprised. None of them acted like anything was wrong. Then her boss, Richard, walked by and clapped Sebastian on the back. Haven't seen you in a while, Richard said, grinning. Sebastian chuckled. Been keeping busy. Richard turned to Avery. You should bring him to happy hour again. That was a blast last time. The floor tilted beneath her feet. Last time? There was no last time. Richard kept talking. Actually, we were just talking about last year's holiday party. I swear, your boyfriend had half the office laughing with that story about the raccoon in your car. Avery's mouth went dry. She hadn't had a boyfriend last year. She hadn't had anyone in years. Her head snapped to Sebastian, but he was already looking at her, waiting for her reaction. There was something expectant in his gaze, something smug, like he was watching the exact moment she realized she was losing her grip on reality. Her throat closed. I have a meeting. She didn't. But she needed an exit. Richard nodded and walked off, leaving them alone again. Avery turned on her heel and strode toward her office, heart slamming into her ribs. She didn't stop, didn't look back, just pushed through the door and tried to shut it behind her, but Sebastian slipped in before she could. He leaned against the desk, looking at her with something almost close to pity. Hey, he said gently, like he was the one trying to calm her down. You okay? Avery pressed a shaking hand to her forehead. You need to leave. He sighed. Avery. Don't. You're panicking. Because you don't exist. He exhaled through his nose, rubbing his jaw. I know this is a lot. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. A lot? Sebastian nodded toward her desk. Why don't you check? Her stomach clenched. She didn't want to. She didn't want to. But her hands were already moving, yanking open drawers, pulling out old paperwork, scrambling for anything, that would prove this was fake. Her employee records. A birthday card from last year's office party. A framed photo of her and Elijah from a weekend trip. He was in all of them. The files listed an emergency contact, Sebastian Carter. The card had a handwritten note from a coworker, hope you and Sebastian celebrate big. The photo, one she had taken alone, now had him in it, standing beside her, arm around her waist like he had always been there. She gasped and shoved the papers away like they had burned her. Sebastian watched her, waiting. This isn't real, she whispered. He nodded. It is. No. Yes. Avery's breath came in shallow bursts. Her memories were screaming at her that this was wrong. That this was impossible. That this man had walked into her life yesterday, but now, every trace of her existence insisted he had always been here. Sebastian reached for her, fingers brushing against her wrist. She jerked back. I need you to leave. Her voice was tight, barely controlled. His expression flickered, something almost hurt, almost regretful. But then he exhaled, nodded, and stepped back. Okay. She didn't trust the ease of his response, but she didn't care. He walked to the door, pausing only once. You should eat something. You look pale. Then he was gone. Avery stayed frozen for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had stood. Her heart was still pounding, her fingers still trembling. She reached for her computer, logged into her social media, and started scrolling. Every post. Every picture. Every tagged memory. Sebastian was in all of them. A birthday dinner 2 years ago, his arm draped over her shoulder. A weekend trip to the mountains, him standing beside her, squinting into the sun. An old high school reunion post, his name mentioned in the caption. She closed her laptop with a sharp click. Her hands curled into fists, nails pressing into her palms. Reality had been rewritten. And somehow, everyone but her was convinced it had always been this way. Avery drove to her mother's house with white-knuckled determination, barely aware of the traffic around her. The radio was off. Silence was the only thing she could stomach right now. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Somewhere in the mess of rewritten memories and altered reality, there had to be proof. Something untouched, something solid. A photo, a letter, an old report card, anything that would tell her she hadn't lost her mind. Her mother's house was a single-story home with yellow shutters, nestled on a quiet street lined with maple trees. It was the kind of place where nothing ever changed, where childhood Christmas decorations were still tucked in the attic, and where old photo albums sat untouched in a cabinet. Avery parked in the driveway, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. The door opened before she could knock. "Sweetheart." Her mother beamed, pulling her into a tight hug. "I wasn't expecting you today." Avery stiffened but forced herself to hug back. Her mother smelled like vanilla and the fabric softener she'd used since Avery was a kid. The normalcy of it made her throat tighten. "Yeah, Avery swallowed, stepping inside. "I was in the area." Her mother closed the door behind them. "Elijah's not with you?" Avery shook her head. "No, he's at school." Her mother gave an approving nod. "That boy's getting taller every time I see him. Just like his dad." Avery's chest tightened. She forced her lips into a smile. "Mom, I need to check something." Her mother frowned. "What do you mean?" Avery didn't answer. She moved past her, walking into the living room. Everything was exactly the same: the floral couch, the framed family photos, the old china cabinet in the corner. The walls were filled with pictures. Her mother. Her father. Herself. Sebastian. Avery's stomach lurched. There he was, in a frame on the mantel, standing next to her mother, his arm around Avery's shoulders. There was another photo, one from Christmas 3 years ago, Avery in a red sweater, Elijah on her lap, Sebastian leaning in to kiss her cheek. She tore her gaze away before she could see more. Her mother sat down, watching her with a puzzled expression. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Avery's hands were clammy. "Where are the old family albums?" Her mother blinked. "Why?" I need to check something." "They're in the cabinet, same place they've always been." Avery didn't hesitate. She crouched down, yanking open the wooden doors. The albums were stacked neatly inside, their covers worn from years of flipping through pages. She pulled out the heaviest one, the one with her childhood photos. Her breath came fast and uneven as she flipped through the pages. There was Sebastian. In a picture of her 8th birthday party, standing next to her, holding the other side of her cake. At a school event, arms slung around her like an older brother or a best friend or someone who had always been there. Her hands shook as she turned another page. A wedding album. The cover was white and embroidered, delicate gold letters spelling out Avery and Sebastian. Her stomach twisted violently. Her fingers felt numb as she opened it. There she was in a lace wedding dress, smiling up at Sebastian as he slipped a ring onto her finger. There were photos of them dancing, cutting the cake, holding hands. The last page had a shot of them running through a tunnel of sparklers, the words "just married" scrawled on a car in the background. A choked noise escaped her throat. This was a nightmare. This was. She slammed the album shut. Her mother flinched. "Avery, what is going on?" Avery shot to her feet. This never happened. Her mother's face twisted with concern. Sweetheart, what are you talking about? Avery pointed at the album, her entire body trembling. This isn't real. Her mother stared at her, completely baffled. Of course, it's real. No, it's not, Avery gasped. Mom, I never married Sebastian. I barely even knew him until yesterday. Her mother's face went pale. Sweetheart, she exhaled slowly. You're scaring me. Avery's pulse roared in her ears. Tell me the truth, she pleaded. Please. Did you just find this album today? Did someone give it to you? Her mother's expression shifted from concern to something almost like sadness. Avery. Mom, she begged. Her mother reached for her hand. Sebastian has always been in your life. Avery yanked her hand away. No. Yes, honey. Tears burned the back of Avery's eyes. I don't remember this, she whispered. Her mother gave her a pained look. Maybe you're she hesitated. Maybe you're overwhelmed. Stressed. It happens. Avery shook her head. No, this isn't stress, Mom. This isn't real. Her mother sighed, then stood and walked to the bookshelf. She pulled down a manila folder and handed it to Avery. Here, she said gently. Avery hesitated before opening it. Inside was a birth certificate. Elijah Carter. Father, Sebastian Carter. Avery couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred. Her legs wobbled, and she grabbed the edge of the coffee table to steady herself. Her mother stepped closer, voice soft. Avery, honey, I don't know what's going on with you, but maybe you need to talk to someone. You and Sebastian have been together for years. You raised Elijah together. She sighed. He loves you. Avery's head shook violently. No. She backed away, shoving the folder at her mother like it was toxic. The walls felt like they were closing in. The photos. The album. The birth certificate. Every part of her life had been rewritten. Her mother's face swam in and out of focus. Avery turned and ran out the door. Avery sat in the waiting room of the therapist's office, gripping a crumpled tissue in her lap. The overhead lights were too bright, the air too still, the sound of the reception desk keyboard clicking too steady. The world around her was normal, painfully normal, while her own mind felt like it was unraveling thread by thread. She hadn't slept. Her body was running on caffeine, adrenaline, and the kind of raw panic that made her stomach churn. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them, the altered photos, the wedding album, the birth certificate with Sebastian's name staring back at her like a joke she wasn't in on. The receptionist called her name. Avery forced herself to stand. Her legs felt unsteady, her heartbeat too loud in her ears. Dr. Evelyn Foster's office was warm and inviting, lined with shelves filled with books about mindfulness and emotional resilience. The walls were a soft blue, the kind of color meant to calm people down. Avery didn't feel calm. Dr. Foster smiled as she gestured for Avery to sit. She was an older woman with kind eyes, the type of person you'd expect to smell like chamomile tea. What's on your mind today? She asked gently. Avery took a breath, twisting the tissue in her hands. I think I might be losing my mind. Dr. Foster nodded, waiting. I don't know how to explain it, Avery continued, her voice unsteady. But my memories, they're wrong. Dr. Foster folded her hands in her lap. Tell me what you mean. Avery hesitated, trying to find the words, but how did you explain something that made no sense? She pressed her fingers to her temples. There's a man, Sebastian. I met him 3 days ago. But now, suddenly, he's in all my photos. My family swears we've been together for years. My son calls him Dad. Dr. Foster tilted her head slightly. And you don't remember him? No, Avery said sharply. Because he wasn't there. Not until now. But somehow, every record, every picture, every document, has changed. My mother showed me a wedding album, for God's sake. I don't remember getting married. Dr. Foster took a slow breath, studying Avery in that way therapists did, as if she was something fragile. Avery, do you think there's a possibility that you're blocking something out? Avery's stomach twisted. No, she said. That's not possible. Dr. Foster leaned forward slightly. Memory can be complex. Sometimes, when a person experiences trauma, the mind suppresses events. Have you considered that there might be a reason you don't remember Sebastian? Avery's breath caught in her throat. No, she whispered. That's not. Dr. Foster opened a drawer and pulled out a file. A thick, heavy file with her name on it. Avery stared at it, her skin crawling. This is your patient history, Dr. Foster said. You've been coming to me for years, Avery. Her hands clenched into fists. No, I haven't. Dr. Foster flipped open the file and turned a few pages. Then she turned the folder around and slid it across the desk toward her. Avery hesitated before looking down. The handwriting was neat and precise. Session notes, Avery Carter. She skimmed the page. Discussion of relationship struggles with Sebastian. Concerns about balancing work, motherhood, and maintaining their marriage. Her mouth went dry. She flipped to another page, her hands shaking. Expressed frustration over Sebastian's work schedule. Concerns about Elijah sensing tension in the home. Another page. Discussed anniversary plans with Sebastian. Feels conflicted about spending too much money on a trip. Avery shoved the file away like it had burned her. This isn't mine. Dr. Foster's brow furrowed. Avery. She shook her head violently. No, this isn't real. I've never been here before today. Dr. Foster's voice softened. You have. Avery shot to her feet, knocking her chair back. No, she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. This isn't happening. Dr. Foster watched her carefully. Maybe we should try grounding exercises, she suggested. Do you want to breathe with me? Avery took a shaky step back. Can I? She swallowed. Can I record this session? Dr. Foster hesitated. Why? Avery forced herself to smile, though it felt wrong on her face. So I can listen later. Try to understand what's happening to me. Dr. Foster studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Of course. Avery fumbled for her phone and hit the record button. Dr. Foster's voice was steady. Tell me what you think is happening, Avery. Avery swallowed hard. I think someone has changed my past. That my memories are real, but the world has been rewritten to make me believe something else. Dr. Foster was silent for a moment. Then. Or maybe your mind is protecting you from something you don't want to remember. Avery's stomach flipped. She ended the recording and shoved her phone into her bag. Dr. Foster leaned forward. Avery, I think we should schedule another appointment. Avery bolted. She ran out of the office, through the hallway, past the receptionist's confused stare. Her heart pounded as she reached her car and fumbled for the keys. This was wrong. This was so wrong. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't. She sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, breaths coming too fast. Her phone was still recording. She turned it off and sat there, frozen, staring at the screen. After a long moment, she hit play. The recording crackled, then Dr. Foster's voice came through, steady and clear. Avery, tell me what you think is happening. Her own voice responded, but it wasn't hers. It was slower. Softer. I think I'm confused, the voice said. I think I've been in denial about Sebastian. Avery's blood went cold. She turned up the volume. Dr. Foster spoke again, calm and patient. And why do you think that? Avery's recorded voice let out a small laugh. Because he's always been here, it said. Avery dropped the phone. Avery sat across from Sebastian in the quiet corner of a coffee shop, gripping her cup so tightly her knuckles ached. Outside, the city buzzed as if nothing was wrong, as if the entire foundation of her existence hadn't been rewritten while the rest of the world continued on, blissfully unaware. Sebastian stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, the picture of ease. He had ordered for her, just like he always did, apparently. According to him, he knew exactly how she liked it. And sure enough, the drink was perfect. That was the problem. She had woken up that morning with a plan. If this was real, if this reality had been altered and not just her mind, then there had to be cracks. Something Sebastian wouldn't know. Something that would prove he was an imposter, that all of this was a fabrication. She lifted the cup to her lips, keeping her voice steady. What was the name of my elementary school? Sebastian didn't blink. Brookview Elementary. Her stomach tightened. My third-grade teacher? Mrs. Adler. Avery forced herself to nod like this was normal, like she wasn't barely holding herself together. Okay, she said casually. What was my favorite toy as a kid? He smirked. Your stuffed rabbit. You called him Pancake because you sat on him once and he got all flattened out. Her pulse spiked. How did I break my wrist in middle school? You fell off Maya's bike trying to do a trick. You told everyone it was because you hit a curb, but really, you just panicked and forgot how brakes worked. Avery's mouth went dry. This wasn't possible. These weren't just random facts. These were intimate details, things no one could just guess, things she hadn't even thought about in years. Sebastian watched her, amusement flickering across his face. Come on, Avery. You're going to have to do better than that. She set the cup down carefully, heart hammering. How did we meet? His expression softened, like he was remembering something fond. You were late to a friend's party. It was pouring rain, and you didn't have an umbrella, so you showed up soaking wet. You were standing by the kitchen sink, wringing out your hair, and I handed you a towel. Avery's chest tightened. That had happened. Only, not with him. That was how she had met Caleb. She had been 22, rushing into a house party thrown by Maya's then-boyfriend. She had arrived drenched, embarrassed, and Caleb had handed her a towel. They had spent the entire night talking, standing in that tiny kitchen, and by the end of the night, he had kissed her. That memory belonged to her and Caleb. Not Sebastian. But Sebastian sat there, completely unfazed, reciting it back to her as if it had always been theirs. Avery gripped the edge of the table. She had to get out of there. She forced a tight smile. I need to make a call. Sebastian raised an eyebrow but didn't stop her as she grabbed her bag and hurried out of the cafe. She walked quickly, breath coming fast, barely noticing the people she bumped into on the sidewalk. She needed someone outside of this nightmare, someone who hadn't been infected by whatever this was. Jonah. He had moved away 5 years ago, long before this nightmare had started. He hadn't been at her wedding, because she hadn't had a wedding. He hadn't met Sebastian. If anyone would remember the truth, it was him. She drove without thinking, gripping the wheel so hard her fingers ached. Jonah lived 2 hours away, in a quiet suburb where he worked as a freelance designer. They had kept in touch over the years, texting sporadically, checking in. He was one of the few people who had known her back when things were simple. When reality made sense. By the time she pulled into his driveway, her pulse was thundering. She rang the doorbell, bouncing anxiously on the balls of her feet. The door swung open, and Jonah's face lit up. Avery. What are you doing here? She let out a breath of relief. He looked the same, scruffy beard, messy hair, that familiar lopsided grin. He was real. This was real. She forced a smile. Can I come in? Jonah frowned slightly but stepped aside. Of course. His house was exactly what she expected, cluttered but cozy, sketches and sticky notes covering half the surfaces. He led her to the kitchen, where a half-finished sandwich sat on the counter next to an open laptop. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. What's up? Avery hesitated, suddenly unsure how to even begin. I need to ask you something. Jonah raised an eyebrow. Okay? She swallowed. Do you remember how I met Caleb? Jonah blinked, then let out a short laugh. Caleb? Wow, that's a throwback. Yeah, of course. Relief flooded her. Yes, she said quickly. At Maya's party, right? When it was raining? Jonah frowned. What? She asked. You mean Sebastian? Her stomach lurched. Jonah tilted his head, looking confused. You showed up soaking wet, and Sebastian handed you a towel. You two were inseparable after that. Avery's breath caught. No, she whispered. Jonah gave her a weird look. What do you mean, no? She shook her head. That was Caleb. Caleb was there that night. You met him. Jonah's brow furrowed. Avery. Sebastian was there. He was the one who handed you the towel. She felt like she was sinking, like the floor was caving beneath her feet. No, she said again, voice cracking. That's not what happened. Jonah rubbed the back of his neck, studying her. Are you okay? You're acting weird. She took a shaky step back. If Jonah believed this, then it wasn't just her family. It wasn't just her photos. Whatever this was, it had reached farther than she thought. She backed toward the door, heart hammering. I have to go, she mumbled. Jonah's face twisted with concern. Avery, wait. But she was already out the door, running to her car. She got in, hands shaking violently as she gripped the wheel. This was impossible. This was impossible. But Jonah had said it so naturally, so casually, like it was the truth. Like it had always been the truth. Avery let out a strangled breath, pressing her forehead against the steering wheel. The world around her had changed. And there was no one left who remembered it the way it was supposed to be. Avery's hands shook as she typed in her credit card information, barely able to focus on the numbers. The airline website flickered for a second, and then the confirmation page loaded. A direct flight to Seattle. One way. Leaving in 4 hours. She didn't know anyone in Seattle. That was the point. It was far enough that she could put actual distance between herself and whatever this nightmare was. She shoved her laptop shut, grabbed her bag, and moved on autopilot, stuffing clothes into a suitcase. Elijah. Her stomach clenched as she hesitated in the doorway of his room. He was still at school. She didn't have time to think about what it meant, leaving him behind, if she was leaving him behind. She wasn't abandoning him, she told herself. She was trying to fix this. To understand. And she couldn't do that if she stayed here, where every person, every piece of evidence, insisted that her life with Sebastian was real. She scribbled a note, hand trembling. Staying with a friend. Be back soon. Love you. Then she was gone. The drive to the airport was a blur. She barely registered the roads, the stoplights, the sun dipping lower in the sky. The car smelled like Elijah's juice box from this morning. The radio played an old song she used to love, but now it made her feel sick. She turned it off. Inside the terminal, people bustled past her, dragging suitcases, sipping overpriced coffee, rushing toward gates. It was the first time in days that she felt invisible. No one was watching her. No one was waiting for her to acknowledge a past that wasn't hers. Her fingers tightened around her passport as she stepped into the security line. She would get on the plane. She would land in Seattle. She would wake up in a hotel room where no one knew her, and then she would figure out what came next. A dull voice droned over the speakers, announcing flight departures. The couple in front of her whispered about their honeymoon. A child in line behind her complained about having to take off their shoes. Normal. She could do normal. When she finally reached the TSA agent, she forced a smile and handed over her ID and boarding pass. The agent barely glanced at her before scanning the ticket. Then he frowned. Avery's breath caught. He studied her ID, flipped it over, then looked up at her. "Ma'am," he said, tapping the plastic card. "This isn't the name on your ticket." Her stomach plummeted. She frowned, reaching for the ID. "That's not possible. I booked the flight under my..." She stopped mid-sentence. Her fingers hovered over the card. Something was wrong. Her name. The letters were in the right order. Her first name, her middle name. But the last name. Carter. She barely heard the agent repeating himself over the roaring in her ears. Sebastian's last name. The plastic card burned against her fingertips. Her vision tunneled as she forced herself to read the rest. The photo was hers. The birth date was correct. Everything looked official. Stamped, laminated, legally binding. Except she had never changed her name. She had never married him. But here it was, government-issued proof that she had. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. "Ma'am?" The agent's voice was more clipped now. "Your reservation is under Avery Matthews. This ID says Avery Carter." I don't know how that happened," she stammered, forcing a laugh that sounded nothing like her own. "It must be a mistake." The agent's expression didn't change. "Do you have any other form of identification?" She reached for her wallet with shaking hands, flipping through credit cards, an old library card, even an expired membership to a gym she hadn't gone to in years. Every single one said Avery Carter. Her hands went numb. "I can," she swallowed, gripping the counter. "I can rebook the ticket." "Not under a different name," the agent said. "You need to update your reservation to match your legal ID." Legal. Because this was real, as far as the world was concerned. Avery's fingers twitched against the counter. "Is there a problem here?" Another voice. A second agent stepped closer. She realized, dimly, that she must look suspicious. Flushed face, panicked breathing, an obvious inability to explain why she was trying to board a plane under a name that, according to their system, no longer existed. "I just need a second," she whispered. "Step aside, ma'am," the second agent said firmly. Her knees nearly buckled as she stumbled out of line. She walked aimlessly, pulse pounding, until she reached an empty section of the terminal near the windows. The tarmac stretched outside, glowing orange from the setting sun. There was no escape. She wasn't just trapped in this nightmare. The nightmare had followed her here. She sank onto a bench, hands shaking in her lap. The overhead speakers announced another departing flight, but it might as well have been in another language. She had come here to leave. To prove that there was still a part of the world untouched by whatever was happening to her. But the past had already caught up. It was printed in plastic. Laminated. Embedded into databases she couldn't hack, stitched into every legal document tied to her name. She wasn't Avery Matthews anymore. She was Avery Carter. She let out a strangled breath and covered her mouth with both hands. The airport blurred. The walls, the signs, the endless sea of people moving past her. No matter where she went, no matter how far she tried to run, there was no way out. Avery sat hunched in the corner of the airport lounge, her arms wrapped around herself like she could hold everything together if she just squeezed hard enough. People bustled around her, travelers scrolling through their phones, exhausted parents wrangling their kids, businessmen hunched over laptops, but it all blurred together into meaningless noise. Her boarding pass sat crumpled in her lap, useless. She had tried to leave. Tried to outrun whatever had twisted her life into this impossible shape. But reality had already caught up. She had been erased. Or rewritten. Her name was no longer Avery Matthews. It was Avery Carter. Her past was no longer hers. It belonged to a stranger. Her hands shook as she pressed them against her temples, breathing in, breathing out, trying to steady herself. None of this was real. None of this could be real. And yet, he had still found her. Sebastian stood at the entrance of the lounge, watching her. She stiffened, her pulse kicking up, hands balling into fists. He didn't look triumphant this time. He didn't look amused or smug or like he was waiting for her to catch up to some game she hadn't agreed to play. He looked tired. His shoulders were slightly slumped, his hands tucked into his pockets. His gaze wasn't sharp, it was heavy, like someone carrying a weight they weren't sure how to put down. Avery wanted to tell him to leave, to turn around and walk back into whatever nightmare he had stepped out of, but her throat was too tight, and her chest ached with something she didn't understand. Sebastian took a slow step forward. She shot up from her chair, breath coming hard and fast. "Stay away from me." He stopped, but only by a few feet. "I can't." She swallowed, voice raw. "Why not?" His jaw tensed for a moment before he exhaled, looking away, as if gathering his thoughts. "Because you asked me not to." Avery flinched. No. No, he was lying. He had been lying from the moment he walked into her life. No, not into her life, into her memories, claiming a place that wasn't his, warping everything, turning every photo, every document, every person she trusted against her. She took a step back. "I don't even know you." Sebastian's gaze flickered to hers, something almost sad in his expression. "Yes, you do," he said softly. "You just don't remember." A chill crept up her spine. Her stomach twisted violently. "No," she shook her head, as if she could shake him away, shake away this entire reality. Sebastian ran a hand through his hair, looking as exhausted as she felt. "You wished for this, Avery." She stilled. A strange buzzing filled her ears. Sebastian sighed, shifting on his feet. "Years ago. You made a wish." Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. He was lying. He had to be lying. She took another step back, but the wall was behind her now, solid and cold. "I don't," her voice cracked. "I don't understand." Sebastian hesitated, like he hated saying the words out loud. "You were in pain," he said finally. "The kind of pain that makes you want to erase everything. And you did." Avery gripped the edge of the chair beside her, fingers digging into the fabric. "No," she whispered. Sebastian's gaze didn't waver. "Yes." A rush of dizziness swept through her. This wasn't happening. She needed to wake up. Sebastian watched her carefully, like he was waiting for something to click into place. "You loved someone," he continued, voice quiet. "And he broke you." The words hit her like a punch to the ribs. Sebastian took a step closer. "You wanted to forget him. You wanted to erase the pain so completely that it never existed." Avery's vision blurred. She didn't remember that. But something deep inside her shifted, a feeling she couldn't name. Sebastian studied her, voice steady but almost gentle now. "The wish didn't just take away the pain, Avery. It rewrote everything. I didn't steal your memories. You gave them away. Her knees felt weak. The airport, the people, the noise, it all faded into static. She wasn't just missing time. She wasn't suffering from memory loss or an altered past. She had chosen this. She had done this to herself. No, she whispered again, but the word barely made a sound. Sebastian exhaled slowly. You asked for a love that had always been there. Someone who would never leave, never hurt you. And the world changed to give it to you. Avery pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. No, she choked out, but the protest felt hollow now. Her mind was spinning, her body frozen, and deep in her chest, something cracked. A love that had always been there. A love that had never left. Sebastian. She squeezed her eyes shut. Somewhere, buried beneath the panic and the fear, beneath the memories that felt unfamiliar and the past she couldn't recognize, there was something else. Something she had forgotten. Or something she had erased. Avery sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers curled into the fabric of her jeans, gripping tightly as if she could anchor herself to something real. The house was quiet, too quiet, except for the faint hum of the dishwasher and the distant sound of a car passing by. Outside, the world carried on like nothing had changed. Like she hadn't just been given an impossible choice. Sebastian stood near the bedroom door, hands in his pockets, watching her carefully. He hadn't spoken in the last few minutes, letting her sit with it. Letting her feel the weight of what was happening. His usual confidence had drained away, leaving something quieter in its place. Patience. Sadness. Avery inhaled sharply, as if the oxygen would help her form words. If I undo it, she said, voice barely above a whisper, what happens to you? Sebastian's eyes softened. I disappear. The words hit her like a punch to the ribs. Her stomach clenched. You mean you die? He shook his head. No. Because I was never really here, Avery. She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. But you are here. You're real. He smiled, but there was no amusement in it. I'm real now, he admitted. Because that's what you wished for. Her throat tightened. She stood up abruptly, pacing to the other side of the room, needing distance, needing movement, needing something to stop the panic clawing its way up her chest. Sebastian didn't move. He just watched. You're saying, she started, her voice unsteady, that if I choose to go back, I'll wake up in a world where you never existed? He nodded once. Avery wrapped her arms around herself. And Elijah? Sebastian hesitated before answering. He won't remember me. She flinched. The room suddenly felt too small. She turned toward him, her voice sharper now. You mean he'll forget? Or do you mean he'll never have known you? Sebastian exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. I mean, it'll be like none of this ever happened. Avery's stomach twisted violently. She couldn't breathe. If she undid this, if she chose her real past, Elijah wouldn't just forget Sebastian. He would lose everything Sebastian had ever been to him. Would it matter? Would it hurt? Or would reality simply correct itself, smoothing out the missing pieces like they had never been there at all? She squeezed her eyes shut. This isn't fair, she choked. Sebastian's voice was quiet. I know. Avery shook her head violently, her hands gripping her elbows. You don't understand. Elijah loves you. He trusts you. Her breath caught. You're his father. Sebastian's expression flickered with something unreadable. Because you made it so. She let out a shaky breath. If she had made it so, could she unmake it? Could she rip this version of life away without consequences? Would Elijah still be the same little boy? Would he miss something he never knew he lost? The thought nearly broke her. She turned away, pressing the heels of her palms into her eyes. I have to go pick him up. Sebastian nodded, as if he had expected that. I'll be here. The words rattled inside her chest. For how much longer? She walked past him, through the hallway, out the front door, her breath shallow, her vision blurring at the edges. She barely remembered the drive to the school. The houses, the stoplights, the familiar roads, everything passed in a haze, her thoughts looping in frantic circles. At the school parking lot, Elijah stood near the curb, kicking at a pebble, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked up as she pulled in, his whole face lighting up, and ran toward the car. Mom, he said, throwing open the door. Dad said we could have burgers tonight. Avery's hands clenched around the steering wheel. Dad. Sebastian was his father. Not just in photographs. Not just in paperwork. In Elijah's heart. She forced herself to smile. That sounds good, baby. Elijah chattered the whole way home, telling her about his day, about how he and his best friend had built the biggest Lego tower at recess, about how his teacher gave them extra reading time because they behaved so well. He was happy. His world was safe. Stable. And now she had to decide if she would break it apart. At home, Sebastian was waiting in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, flipping burger patties in a pan. The smell of sizzling beef filled the air, mixing with the sound of Elijah tossing his backpack onto the couch, running up behind Sebastian and wrapping his arms around his waist. Sebastian laughed, ruffling his hair. There's my sous chef, he teased. Wanna help with the fries? Elijah nodded eagerly, dragging a stool over to the counter. Avery stood in the doorway, watching them. Watching the life she had built. The life she had wished into existence. She had given herself everything she thought she wanted. A love that had always been there. A man who never left. A child who had both of his parents. Wasn't this better than what she had before? Wouldn't it be selfish to take it away? The ache in her chest deepened. At dinner, Elijah sat between them, happily eating, telling stories, swinging his feet under the table. Sebastian looked at her across the table, expression unreadable. She knew he was waiting. Waiting for her to decide. Later, after Elijah had fallen asleep curled up on the couch, she sat across from Sebastian, barely breathing, memorizing everything. If she erased this, would Elijah feel the loss? Would there be a gap in his heart, something missing he couldn't name? Or would it be as if Sebastian had never existed at all? Sebastian exhaled, leaning forward, resting his arms on his knees. Avery. His voice was soft. You don't have to decide tonight. She swallowed. I do, she whispered. Sebastian searched her face. Why? Her voice cracked. Because I don't think I can go to sleep knowing I might wake up and you won't be here. His lips parted slightly, like he hadn't expected that answer. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Sebastian nodded. Then let's make tonight count. Avery didn't trust herself to speak. She just nodded, heartbreaking, knowing what was coming. Avery lay awake in the dark, listening to the steady rise and fall of Sebastian's breath beside her. She had spent hours memorizing the sound, the weight of it, knowing it wouldn't be there tomorrow. Sebastian had fallen asleep with one arm draped over his stomach, his face turned slightly toward her, peaceful in the dim light from the hallway. He didn't know that she had already decided. She had held on to the possibility of another choice for as long as she could. She had let herself imagine staying in this version of her life, waking up to the smell of coffee that Sebastian had brewed, watching Elijah race into the kitchen to wrap his arms around him, hearing them laugh, feeling whole. But it wasn't real. It was built on something missing, on a wish made out of grief. Her past, the real past, wasn't something she could erase. And she didn't want to anymore. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake him. Her fingers hovered over his arm, the warmth of his skin beneath them, but she didn't touch him. She couldn't. Instead, she stood, padding softly out of the room and into Elijah's. He was curled under his blanket, clutching a stuffed dinosaur to his chest. His drawings were still taped to the wall, bright, colorful scribbles of his family. Sebastian was in every one. A lump formed in her throat. She leaned down, brushed a kiss against his forehead, and whispered, "I love you, baby." Elijah sighed in his sleep, shifting slightly, and Avery forced herself to straighten, to step away, to leave the room before she changed her mind. Sebastian was still asleep when she climbed back into bed. She curled onto her side, staring at him, whispering the goodbye she couldn't say out loud. Then she closed her eyes. And she let herself remember. She woke up gasping. The ceiling above her wasn't the one she had fallen asleep under. The bed beneath her wasn't the one she had shared. She shot up, her chest heaving. The apartment was different. Smaller. Colder. The walls were bare, empty of the warmth that had filled the home she had left behind. Sebastian was gone. She stumbled out of bed, nearly tripping over the sheets tangled around her legs. Her breath came in short bursts as she raced down the hall, throwing open Elijah's door. His room was smaller. His bookshelf held fewer toys, his bed a little different, but he was there. And his drawings. She turned toward the wall. The bright crayon sketches were still there. But Sebastian wasn't in them. Avery pressed a hand to her mouth. Her stomach clenched. Her vision blurred. She knew this reality was real. She had asked for it back. But it still hurt. She forced herself to move, to step out of the room, to walk toward the small living area where framed photographs lined the shelf above the couch. They were back to normal. Elijah's baby pictures. A photo of her and Maya. Her parents' wedding picture. No Sebastian. No wedding album. No traces of the life she had built out of a wish. She reached for her phone with shaking fingers, not even sure what she was looking for until she was already typing his name. Sebastian Carter. The search yielded nothing. No photos. No records. No connections. She had undone everything. She exhaled shakily and stared at the blank screen. Then, before she could stop herself, she typed another name. The one she hadn't spoken in years. Caleb Wright. The man who had broken her heart. The man she had wanted to forget so badly that she had erased him from her life entirely. Her breath hitched when his profile popped up. He still existed. A new photo stared back at her, a familiar face, but different now. Older. His hair was shorter than she remembered, his smile a little different. He was tagged in a picture at a friend's wedding, arm around a woman Avery didn't recognize. Their paths had never crossed again. She let out a slow, unsteady breath. There had been a time when she had loved him enough to break herself over it. And there had been a time when she had been so desperate to forget that she had rewritten reality itself. But now, he was just someone she had once known. Someone who had left a mark, who had hurt her, but who had also been part of her story. And she could live with that. She put her phone down. The weight in her chest hadn't disappeared, but it felt different now. Lighter. She stepped toward the window, looking out at the world below. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't painless. But it was hers. And that was enough.